Hi, good morning. This is the Gardener community meeting. Today we have two topics. Tim will talk about mock provider POC, and Lukas will give an overview on the new dashboard release. Tim, you can take over.
Thanks, Matthias. I guess you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, so then let me quickly share my screen.
Can
you see the presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. So today I want to talk about what I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 weeks. This is a POC, a proof of concept for the mock provider. But first of all, what is the mock provider? What is the idea behind it? So the mock provider is basically an alternative provider to the infrastructure providers, and it implements the Gardener extension points, but without using any infrastructure. So this is the basic idea. And why would you do such a thing? Basically, we want to be able to develop Gardener faster and without any infrastructure. So currently there's still at least one existing Kubernetes cluster required to use as a seed cluster in your local setup. But with the mock provider, you could do that without any infrastructure. And we also want to be able to run Gardener tests faster and also more cost efficiently. Therefore, in those scenarios, we want to be basically independent from the Gardener extensions, but also from the infrastructure provider. So if we develop or test some stuff only related to Gardener and not related to any extensions or infrastructure, this would help us there. So how could we do such a thing like the mock provider? Basically, Gardener already provides those extension points. So the basic idea is that Gardener creates or annotates extension resources on the seed clusters, which then get reconciled by the extensions themselves. And the Gardener waits for them to be ready. So quick recap. Here's a simple scheme of how the shoot cluster reconciliation is working at the moment. And we see here those extension points. Basically, those are all CRDs on the seed cluster, like DNS provider, infrastructure, backup stuff, control plane, operating stuff, workers, and network. So basically, a mock provider or NoOp or local provider, however you might call it, could set all of those resources to ready, but without doing anything. So you could run such a local provider or mock provider on a real seed, of course, but also on a local seed to develop Gardener completely locally. So let's jump into a demo. Let's create such a mock shoot. I've created and prepared a kind cluster on my local machine. This kind cluster runs in a Docker container. You see it here. And I'm connected to it. I see only one node, but there's actually nothing running by default here. So this cluster I registered in my local setup as a seed cluster. There's actually not much special here. The only thing is this disable DNS taint, which tells the Gardener to not deploy any DNS providers and use the load balancer's IP addresses for communication. Then I also created a mock cloud profile in my local setup, which is actually nothing special. And I also created a mock provider controller registration, which is basically telling the Gardener that there is a provider that is responsible for most of the extension resources except DNS entries and providers. And then I have a manifest for a shoot, which basically uses this mock profile and the mock provider. We use the newly introduced purpose field with the value testing, which basically helps us to create a much lightweighter setup. So there will be no monitoring or logging control plane deployed in this local seed cluster. I use a specific mock provider type. Config looks pretty similar to an AWS config, for example. I use this seed cluster I just registered. We see the DNS section is commented out because I don't use it and use this DNS disable taint. The rest is actually pretty similar to all of the other shoots. So let's jump into the terminal again. We see here in my local setup, I have the cloud profile, I have the local seed cluster, which is a kind cluster. I also have installed the controller registration, but I don't have any shoots yet. Currently, I'm running the mock controller from my local machine. Basically, this is just a bash script. It's not implemented properly yet, but it's just a bash script looping of all the extension resources and patching them to succeeded. And now I can go ahead and create my mock shoot that I just shown you. And we see over here, it gets created. It's in state processing. You can watch that. And it's currently starting up. We see it here on the seed cluster. Currently, there's only the Kube API server service, and now some pods get created and stuff like that. You can get the kube config, save it for later, and then we will come back later because it takes some time to create. So let's jump into the presentation again. Because there are some technical restrictions for implementing such a mock provider. And the most prominent one being is that in Gardener, there's network connectivity from the shoot control plane to the shoot nodes required. And because control planes and the shoot nodes often run in different infrastructure accounts or maybe even on different infrastructures entirely. So Gardener checks this VPN connection in the shoot reconciliation flow to make sure that it is working. And if we don't want to change this check, which is basically crucial for the Gardener, such a mock shoot would need at least one running node to host the VPN shoot pod. So there will be VPN connectivity. So what I did now in my POC is I looked into how I could create such a mock node for the shoot. And yeah, I have some alternatives that I was considering, for example, like kind, Kubernetes and Docker. I just shown you that I use this for a local seed cluster, but you could, of course, run this kubelet and container runtime in a Docker container also on an existing Kubernetes cluster like your seed cluster, and use this as a mock node and register it to the Shoots API server, basically directly next to the control plane in the seed cluster. But I tried that, and actually it does not work on CoreOS because there are some issues with systemd running in a container if you do that in CoreOS, and because it's currently the default OS on our clusters, this is not so good. And also kind uses kubeadm for bootstrapping and registering the nodes and so on, which would introduce some overhead and complexity for this mock provider. I also considered using something like kubevirt, which basically brings a whole hypervisor to the Kubernetes cluster. But of course, this also introduces much complexity, and therefore I didn't look into it further. So the conclusion was basically to build an own solution for such a lightweight virtual node. This is basically the core part of my POC, which I'm going to present you now. So this is what I came up with. I wanted to run a pod on the seed cluster next to the shoots control plane, which we see here, and run basically a whole node, a virtual node in this pod. So normally the kubelet would register at the Kube API server via its load balancer and fetch the pods from there. So I started a kubelet container inside this node pod, and also a Docker in Docker container, which basically is able to run Docker containers in an existing Docker container. So the kubelet is configured to talk to this Docker in Docker container. It communicates via localhost and can run those system components that are needed for a Kubernetes cluster, for example, Kube DNS or Kube proxy CNI plugins and stuff like that. But for the Gardener, of course, most relevant, the VPN shoot pod. Normally, this would have a load balancer attached to it, which can be used then by this VPN seed sidecar in the Kube API server pod to set up the VPN connection. But as we are now running on the same cluster, we don't even need such a load balancer. And if we're running on a local cluster, we can't even create such load balancers. So this basically falls apart, and we don't need it anymore. And we can use a node port service for the VPN shoot. And the VPN seed sidecar can connect to this port on the pod because it's running on the same cluster. So back to the demo. Let's see how our mock shoot is doing. Let's go back to this terminal window here. Okay, we're seeing Gardener is currently reconciling the shoot again. I guess it's already completely created. Let's see if this is the case. Yeah, we see here is the whole control plane, etcd, Kube API server and stuff. And also this pod, the mock shoot worker, which is basically this Docker and Docker node, which I just presented. And we see here is the stuff inside our mock shoot cluster, which is running completely local. We have one node, it is ready. It gets its Calico node pod, which I was using as a simple installation of a CNI. And it also runs the system components, for example, VPN shoot pod. And therefore, the Kube API server can connect to this mock shoot. So what I'm going to do now is to do some basic testing on my mock shoot. I'm creating a service and a deployment for Nginx. And we can see there's a container starting up. At the moment, it's pretty slow on my local machine. I haven't investigated this further, but yeah, let's give it some seconds to start. Let's wait for it to be ready. You see it's much slower on the local machine, but you can of course also run this on the seed cluster, which on real Kubernetes cluster, which would make it much faster. So now what I'm going to do is do a port forward for this service I just created. And then I'm able to reach this pod on my localhost address. So this is basically a fully functioning cluster, this mock shoot. Yeah, that would be it for the demo. So I will jump back to the presentation. There are also some caveats at the moment. This is also still a POC, as I mentioned, and is not implemented properly. So there are some restrictions. At the moment, you can only create a single node mock shoot because networking wasn't working out so well for multi-node mock shoots. We didn't get that to work, but it might not be relevant for the first step, but might be possible. The seed needs this disabled DNS taint. Yeah, I've looked into mocking the DNS providers and stuff, but I didn't need that for a first running version of the mock shoot, but this is not implemented yet. On a local cluster, yeah, we need some workarounds because we don't have a load balancer implementation. So normally the Cloud Controller Manager would create such load balancers on the infrastructure. But of course, this is not running in our local cluster. So we have to patch the Kube API server service to the running host's IP. And therefore, we can only use one mock shoot. But yeah, still works for this. You saw a pretty low performance. This could be improved, of course. And at the moment, there's no increase in controller for stuff running in the seed cluster. And yeah, because I worked on this the last week and wanted to present it today, there's no documentation yet. So where do we want to go from here? The next step would be to upload my code. I will publish it on a repo and do some documentation for it. So if you're interested, you can look into that. And then the next step would basically to implement this properly. So in Golang with the whole extension libraries, just like the other provider extensions. Then you could also mock the DNS providers and entries. You could also use Machine Controller Manager and include the provider in there to do basically an end-to-end test scenario with the mock provider. And then we basically want to use that in our automated Gartner tests. And we can even go one step further. So there was an idea about implementing a mock CRD. And this answers also the question why it's even called mock provider. So the idea was to be able to mock such basically extension interfaces, just like in a unit test, you would do it. And you could specify something like this. You would say, hey, if you get an infrastructure with this name and region Middle Earth, you should put out an error like region Middle Earth not found or something like that. Or you would say it should always get to succeeded, which is currently the default. Yeah, you could implement it this way, but there's no work going on in this direction. So this is all to be decided and to be implemented. Yeah, and this is basically it for my presentation. And now I'm happy for some questions or feedback if you want to provide some. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tim. Any questions? Comments?
Daniel, you're not hearable. You're not audible. Maybe some other questions in the meanwhile.
No.
That's the comment. Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Daniel, I guess you're now audible.
Okay, great. Do you have any idea why the mock shoot is not performant as you mean, or as you said? Is it because yeah, what could be the reason for it?
At the moment, I'm not sure. I also wanted to try to specify some explicit Docker commands on the kind cluster to give it, ensured resources, but I hadn't have time to look into that. I was also testing if the network speed is slower, because if you're running on a real Kubernetes cluster in a hyperscaler, you get, of course, much better network performance than, for example, in the office. Yeah, this could be the case, but I'm not sure at the moment.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just one comment. With respect to the MCM part, yeah, you had already mentioned probably we should integrate it with the MCM. Even I kind of agree, because if we move this mocking into the MCM in future, be down the road, I think that should be better.
Mhm. Yeah, it would
Thank
be
you.
really nice to have such an integration. Yeah, maybe we
Yeah,
can
maybe we
collaborate
can
on that.
coordinate. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
nice.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe one comment to the performance. I think you're running in Docker desktop, your kind cluster, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Maybe you could check your preferences in the advanced section there. You will see what the underlying virtual machine is actually using. And I think it defaults to 1 CPU of your laptop.
I guess I configured 6 CPUs, but not sure if this is configured correctly.
Thanks, Tim. So we have one more topic by Lukas presenting the new version of dashboard.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Can you see my browser?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So we recently released a new dashboard version with lots of changes. The full list is in GitHub. I have a more condensed list with the important things that we changed. So first of all, for all developers that want to contribute and have a local dashboard running, we now switch to Yarn for dependency management. So please use Yarn to resolve dependencies. The other changes, or the most notable changes, include, first of all, we have now enabled paging also for project lists. So we already had paging for the all projects page, but we now also enabled it for regular projects. The reason is that we discovered performance issues with large projects, with clusters that with like 30 or even more clusters. So we now have it enabled everywhere. Then we switch to the new URLs for the monitoring stack. So I have here an old dashboard running. So to show you what changed here is just open a shoot. So for in the old URLs we had no valid certificate. You see here that it's not secure. And now with the new ones, we have a valid certificate, and yeah, we now support this also on the dashboard. Okay, so then we have for all cluster conditions, we now have detailed tooltips built in. We also support configuring them via the dashboard config, so also for custom conditions, and if you want to override the default descriptions, it is now possible. I can show it. So we now have a more lengthy text to explain the different conditions here. Let's close this one. So then we have switched to the new core gardener.cloud API finally. So this is visible when you create shoots with the dashboard and switch to the YAML tab. You will notice that we now have the new shoot specification in place. Then another thing that lots of users complained about was that if you have a hibernated cluster, like this one here, let's go to one. So I have a hibernated cluster here, and if I start this cluster with the dashboard, it immediately looks like it is already started, even if it's currently waking up from hibernation. And this is kind of irritating. So we try to improve this behavior. So now with the new version, let's go to the same cluster. If I now wake up this cluster with the new dashboard, you see that it's still in the it still shows as hibernated, and you can see in the tooltip and the description that it's currently waking up. You can also see this here, and this helps to to visualize this, the real state in the dashboard. Okay, what else? Yeah, we have now support for showing ANSI characters sequences, or render them correctly in the dashboard. So you see here, I have a screenshot from a cluster that has some issues, and we show what we get from back from Gardner from the logs, and you see some ANSI character sequences inside the text that are not rendered correctly. So I will show the same message with the new dashboard, and it looks now better. We don't have these characters rendered as text, but we try to render the text accordingly. So in this case, make it bold. Okay. So then, yeah, we now show available load balancer classes for OpenStack clusters if there are any configured. That helps to that helps to make them to find load balancer and attach it to the to a service. So I have a screenshot for that. Just find it. This one here. So we have on the shoot cluster detail page, we have now this available load balancer classes a section or tile, and if you click on one of the load balancer classes, you see the details, so the name and also the subnet ID. This was requested by the OpenStack users. So other than that, we have now the possibility to configure zones for each worker group when creating a cluster. So if I go to the create cluster dialog, you see now that for every worker, it is possible to define the zones individually. And we also now have full support for multi-zone clusters. So we define the required subnets in the shoot config that are, for example, required for AWS and other infrastructure providers. Okay, and then last but not least, we will release support for VMware vSphere soon. So I can show some screenshots how this will look like. So you see here on the top of the list, the new clusters, the new infrastructure, and also on the Create Cluster page, we will have a new button for vSphere clusters. And of course, all the other pages also prepared. I think that's all from my side. Do you have any questions?
There seem to be no questions. Thank you, Lukas. Does anyone have another topic for discussion? Seems also not to be the case. Then see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.